Yeah, microphone will help. Fantastic. I'm just going to make sure this is going to play. Oh, there we go. One of the things that I like about the fact that we're competitors today is that I am merely in competition with myself, which, if ever there was a metaphor for my life, that is it. Hello everyone upstairs. Nice to see you up there as well. Oh, and online too. I'm Laura Kalbag, and I'm going to get right into it. So where are the edges of design? It's such an amorphous kind of big field. So much of it can fit into this big box of what design really is. Like, I call myself a designer, but I do a huge amount of writing. I do some speaking. I do plenty of coding. I still call myself a designer when I'm doing all of those things. Because really, everybody does design. So this is the point at which I say, if you are a developer or anybody else in the audience who doesn't identify as a designer, you're all doing design whenever you're working, whatever you're creating. Because every single decision that you make on a project is a design decision, from the business model to the choice of framework that you use, to the icons and their labels. All of this is design. Design is also amorphous because it's that little word that can encompass so much and means so much. That we all have different ideas of what makes design and what makes us designers, but it is the planning. It is also the process, and it is also the product. We call all of these things design. And when designers work with non-designers, or people who don't necessarily identify as being designers, the deliverables, those documents we hand over to each other, that's what we often consider as being the design. A lot's changed in the time that I have been a designer, the time that I have been in the industry. I guess I've been following design in tech for probably around the last 20 years. I know I look incredibly young. And I've been working professionally in it for about 13 years or so. I've done client work, I've done web design, I've done app design, I've done development, of course. I've run a not-for-profit. I've also worked with startups. And as someone who has an interest in tech in general, and how tech has a huge impact on the rest of the world, and increasingly so, I've always been fascinated by the changes in the role of design in that world. So let's have a look at some of the history of design on the web. Bearing in mind this very much leans Western. I guess it leans kind of mostly English-speaking, mostly kind of towards the North America, Australasia, Europe side of things, because of course that's where I'm from and where I've been learnt about design from. It's safe to say the web kind of really started hitting the mainstream in around 1995. 1991 was the first website, but 1995, and I think that the Batman Forever movie website is a great example of, oh, you know something is mainstream when movies are starting to use it. And this is an interesting kind of design to look at and look back at. We're kind of leaning back into this design nowadays, aren't we? We like these kind of neon aesthetics. But this is pretty much an image with some clickable areas on it, and that's what a lot of the web was, especially on the visual side back then. And a lot of the deliverables that we started using back then had been brought over from other industries. Like, the tech industry's design work was really influenced by what had come before. So at this point, we were very influenced by print design. And as you can tell from this kind of design that looks like a movie poster with some links on it, we were also shaped by the restrictions that the web itself had. And it was a lot more limited back then as well. And of course, the people who knew the medium the best always knew how to break the rules the best and make the most creative design. So let's dig into some of the deliverables that we had at that time, or rather these deliverables that we have used across time, because a lot of these are evergreen. We really have used them a lot. These are the ones that originated in other fields. So we have industrial design and engineering, software design. A lot of these were doing design work before we on the web were doing design work. And we've adopted a lot of their visual languages back for our own needs. So flow diagrams, the first in a series of boxes and arrows. We love boxes and arrows. It's amazing how much we can communicate with just a rectangle and a directional line. Whether it's the flow of a user, it could be the flow of information, pretty much anything can be mapped as boxes and arrows. The sitemap is that flow diagram's cousin, so it's pretty much more boxes and more arrows, but it's just got a little dose of hierarchy in there as well, a bit of structure. Each box represents a page. I guess nowadays we define websites less as pages, but I guess that's the end experience that the user often has. And sitemaps can really be used for any kind of hierarchical information. It doesn't have to be page specific. Wireframes are where we start really getting into layout. And these are just rough outlines of layouts that can be fairly detailed, rendered on a computer, or drawn really shoddily by hand, like this one. And they don't even have to be used for full pages or full views. They can just be useful for small components that are very detailed or much lower fidelity. Style guides, I will come back to these later, because they've not been so popular in tech, but they are definitely something that we've borrowed from other industries. They're a collection of guidelines which designers can use to assemble products with a consistent look and feel. So no talk would be complete without me shaming myself for my previous design work. And mock-ups and comps are a classic example of this, as I like to call them pictures of websites. And this is a classic picture of a website, which you can see I designed in 2011 for a conference. And as a young designer, I was very much guilty of jumping straight into the visual mock-up. Because why use a quick form of communication and a rough document when you could really dig straight into doing something really detailed and then find out after you've done hours and hours and days of work that nobody likes it and it's completely wrong? Deliverables are so often about that handoff, that idea that we hand over a completed document from one of us to the next, for somebody else to implement it or for somebody else to approve it. And I absolutely hate it. I really hate the term handoff because it puts me in mind of a relay race where you're running along, you produce this document, you're running along, you're handing it, you're gonna hand it to someone, then whoosh, they're gone. You're never ever going to see that document ever again. And will that look anything like the final product? No, probably not. I think artifact is probably a more fitting term for these kinds of documents because that brings to mind archaeology. Because our deliverables are so often historic documents of ideas that once were and are completely out of date when that final product goes live. And everybody has their own preference and style when it comes to deliverables. Maybe it's dictated by what you personally enjoy. Maybe your employers decided things should be a particular way, or your manager, or your education has made you lean towards using a particular deliverable. Or maybe a pretty looking document has just caught your eye online and you've wanted to make something as pretty as that. Because never underestimate the power of somebody in tech being swayed by the pretty and the shiny and the new. So the examples that I'm including here, as I said before, are very much influenced by my own experiences and my biases. So if I've missed any cool deliverables in this talk, please come tell me later. Don't tell me right now. Don't shout out right now. I have been heckled at a talk before. It did not go well for the person who heckled me, so don't. But come tell me afterwards, because I want to make this more of an evolving idea. I think that this is an interesting thing to explore, how these deliverables work and why we choose them. So as someone who often hasn't really worked a lot with other designers, I've only kind of recently started working with other designers because a lot of the time I was working solo or as part of a very small team. And so I'm really curious about why we choose to use the documents that we do, what we decide to call design. Does it depend on the audience, the length of the project, the final product, the sprint. So to help me understand the purpose and the best use of these deliverables, I decided to look at their qualities, like what makes them similar and what makes them different. And they're kind of hard to categorize. Like the freedom of the visual languages we have make for a huge amount of variety. So I found it easier to map their qualities across a series of spectrums. So starting off with fidelity. Now I don't know if this is necessarily the most important one, but it's probably the one we notice first. So we kind of move from having very planning-oriented documents to very production-oriented documents. So the higher fidelity is much closer to production, the lower fidelity is much closer to planning. Maybe even the high production documents are the ones that are used in production themselves. So here I've just mapped some of the existing deliverables that I talked about across this spectrum. I wish I had much longer arms at this point. I'm just going to wave generally in that direction. I'm going to look at my screen down here. So we've got flow diagrams. They're much more towards the planning angle of that. Nobody is going to see you use a flow diagram as the in production, maybe. Sitemaps, you're not going to use those in production. They're a planning document. Your low fidelity wireframes, they look similar to production, but they are not production documents themselves. But as we get further up to style guides, well, actually a lot of that will end up being used in production. And a lot of the high fidelity wireframes and the mock-ups will end up being used in production. So they're much closer to the production end of things. The spectrum of the perceptual to the functional, I've kind of called this the expression. I'm not really sure if that's the right term. I've borrowed these endpoints, perceptual and functional, from this fantastic design systems book by Alla Kolmatova. And at one end, we have the perceptual deliverables, the ones that describe the atmosphere, the look and feel of what we're building, even branding. And at the other end, we have the more functional that describes the behavior of what we're building. And so looking at the mappings here again, it's almost flipped to some degree. The more production-ready documents are the ones that are more likely to be perceptual, the ones that are about the look and feel. Whereas the sitemaps and the flow diagrams and low-fidelity wireframes, they're much more to do with the functionality and how things work. The expertise of who creates the deliverable is also something that we need to consider. Like, do you have the capability of actually creating that deliverable in the first place? And I think this maps from a generalist to a specialist skill type. So some might be easy for everyone to create and some are much harder. Oh, there's a little something shifted there. And so flow diagrams, I mean, everyone can draw stuff with boxes and arrows. It might not necessarily be a good or useful diagram, but you can do it and it works. Whereas if you're going to be creating a style guide or a mock-up, generally a lot more specialist skills are required. And sitemaps, somewhere in the middle, you need an understanding of how a site is structured. But again, drawing boxes and arrows, not that difficult. We also have to consider the audience in terms of the deliverables we're producing. I actually think this is one of the most important factors in what we're choosing to use. It's not just that input that requires expertise, it's how people understand what you're giving to them. And so the audience can also go from a specialized audience who understand what you're getting at, understand your area, to a far more general audience, be it your boss, be it a client, be it even an end user. And so things like sitemaps and mock-ups are much easier to understand for folks who don't necessarily have those specialized skills, whereas when you're getting towards style guides, in order to use a style guide and make use of it, you do need more of that specialist understanding. So flipping back into the history of the web, we're going back to when it was still pretty early days, 96 to 98. Things are kind of looking more like posters still, kind of a retro vibe going on to the old A List Apart site here. Can you believe this is what A List Apart used to look like? I mean, I'm pretty into the color scheme. This feels like it's actually kind of my kind of color scheme for sure. But you can see that starting to consider the full width of the layout. That's pretty cool. And yet, even though it was the early days of the web, we were starting to think about accessibility. I don't know if anyone had a bet on how long it would be before I mentioned accessibility. It was going to happen. So making the web usable for disabled people has always been an interest in the web, trying to standardize it, trying to make it easy for everyone to make websites that are usable by a very wide audience. I wouldn't necessarily say it's always been a priority for the web, but the impetus has been there. The people have been fighting for it. And if anybody else is new to the concept of accessibility, yet to discover its wonders, there is a book you may be interested in that Leanne mentioned earlier. And there's also, you should check out Alistair's talk later today, because that is going to be fabulous. Accessibility is one of those things that often falls on the edges of design. People always consider making technology usable for disabled people as often being not important, or not important to do right away. There may not be the budget. It may be something that we defer to the next milestone, or to after the MVP is ready. Like, the amount of time that people would not consider accessibility part of the minimum viable product is unbelievable. Even though making sites accessible really does benefit everybody, it so often just falls off those edges. And the worst thing is when disabled people are described as edge cases. And I say this because I've heard it said to me multiple times, well, why should I do that? That's just dealing with edge cases. Like they're uncommon, like their experiences don't matter. People are not edge cases, but they do often get left in the margins, despite the fact that 15% of the global population is disabled. Across the millennium, we saw the first dot-com crash. I'm saying first because I reckon we might be headed for a second. But if you look at the design here, and no offense to anyone who did Flash design back in the day, I know we all loved things that look like this, but I mean, if you look at a website like that requires instructions on how to use the interface, on the interface itself, you probably think, yeah, maybe that's why there was a dot-com crash, huh? And this was kind of the beginning of the era of the Web 2.0, the user-generated content, when we started talking about platforms instead of websites, when we started having content management systems, and when we had a huge amount of Flash. Anybody here remember the Flash days? Excellent, I am not the only old person in the room. Usability is pretty much what we used to call experience design before we got all obsessed with delighters and things like that. And Steve Krug's book was, Don't Make Me Think, was quite a fundamental part of that at the time. It was the key text on web usability. And the focus on web design did start to lean away from these funky experiments in weird browser Chrome to actually thinking about how we help people actually use the things that we're building, how we help people complete their intended tasks. And if you're interested in usability, I would really recommend that you go to Liliana's and Philip's talk tomorrow, which is at 2:30 or 14:30, if you're feeling particularly European about it. And this is when we started using personas, which had been used in software design before, but it's when we started adopting them more in the tech industry. And personas are these fictional characters that are designed to represent sort of typical users. And designers and developers use them as a way of relating their design back to the user, reminding yourself always, is this what this person would like? Is this what this person would be able to use? And it's a kind of a funny kind of deliverable, because it's not really something that you hand over so much as a supporting document. And I think there are a lot of deliverables that fall into this. And so personas really are on the planning end of the spectrum. They're neither functional nor perceptual, but I guess maybe more towards the functional side. They're generally produced by specialists, because you do have to have done some research, to have spoken to users to be able to produce them in the first place. But the audience is supposed to be general. Everyone should understand them. From 2003 to 2006, we started getting into the era that I'm going to call the web as its own medium. It's when web design kind of started to have its own look and feel. We were really embracing boxes because that was what we had to work with, was boxes. Often it was tables. I don't know if anyone else has ever written a website in tables, but bless you and bless you for moving away from that. And it was when we also started understanding the medium that we had. A lot of people were like, well, people are only going to view my website on an 800 by 600 screen, so I'm going to make my website 800 by 600 pixels. And one of my favorite types of design, which I really loved and really envied and struggled to produce myself, was grunge design, because I thought it looked really cool. And it was really fun spending hours making those textures in Photoshop. And so that was very big at the time. And this was the era of Safari. It's when we finally got Safari, WordPress 0.7. This is when we started talking about the separation of content, design, and structure. I mean, you remember that when we used to separate those things rather than stick them all in the same file? This is when we started to design for mobile devices, when YouTube and Reddit and Google Analytics and Twitter started becoming things. It's when Adobe bought Macromedia, the company that made Flash as well. And from 2006 to 2008, we got the dawn of the smartphone and the apps. That grunge trend continued apace, probably fueled by me and my admiration for it. The iPhone was launched, and that really boosted the popularity of mobile sites and apps. And it was the beginning of the death of Flash, of course, because the iPhone was not going to have Flash on it. It's when we got Behance, the artwork sharing site, and was the advent of Google Chrome, the downfall of us all. And this brings me to a different quality of deliverables that came around about this time. The platform, like obviously, because we had to start considering, are we designing for a specific platform, or are we going to try to design for cross-platform? And so the nature of the platform that you're designing for really does have an impact on that deliverable. The same deliverable can't be used for everything. Come on, clicker. Got to point it at the actual computer, that's what helps. And so things like sitemaps and mock-ups tended to be a lot more platform specific. A sitemap is not going to be the same for a website as it is going to be for an app. Whereas the usefulness of style guides started coming about because, hey, you can create these looks and feels that can be then used and interpreted across different platforms. We also had a lot of fun arguing about apps versus websites in 2009 to 2011. If anyone remembers that time, this is what everyone was blogging about. Should it be an app or should it be a website? Is it more app-like? Is it more site-like? Is it a spectrum? Is it a binary? Do you put sites in your apps or do you put apps in your sites? Do you encourage people to download apps when you go to your sites? It's amazing to think what we used to do and spend our time on. We really argued about all of it. In this era, we were getting Typekit. That was when nice fonts were being brought to the web. Facebook likes. Twitter became a bit more mainstream rather than just the nerds using it. We had, in 2010, Google Web Fonts, Pinterest, Instagram, Sketch. The idea of designing for different devices. And we also, don't forget, argued a huge amount about flat design versus skeuomorphism. I reckon that one's going to come back around sometime soon. In 2009 was the launch of Dribbble, and Dribbble was a platform for sharing design work captured in those little thumbnails, small, very aesthetic doses. And while Behance had kind of been around for a long time, we were starting to get people using their online presences as more of a means for getting hired. I remember the days when it used to be you had a blog to share your knowledge. At this stage, we started getting into that thought leader territory, and now we are going down a horrifying hole of tech influencers. And yeah, it's disgusting. Do not like it. I think it's one thing to be very inspired by other people's work online. It's how we all learn collectively. But it was certainly, when we started thinking about sharing things as thumbnails, and it's all about the aesthetics, we started seeing more solid design trends, more like homogenized design work. But it's a vital part of people's career development and it's how they were finding work. Back to more designs of shame. This is actually a mock-up that I did because I could tell because it's like a few different conference sites mashed together. You can tell the ribbon banner, that was a big one back then. And 2012 was the rise of the unicorn startup. In 2011, there were a few startups that were valued at $1 billion or more, but the number has climbed and climbed and climbed in the last decade. In 2014, Google launched material design, web animation became popular. In 2015, Microsoft Edge was finally arrived. Designing for wearables, I mean, I'm not sure how much of that we're doing now, but we did start getting the early variable fonts. In 2012, Samantha Warren came up with the idea of style tiles. And this was a sign of how design was becoming less about those detailed mock-ups and more about communicating general themes in a way that can be interpreted into more flexible designs by the rest of the team. And so you could take a style guide and make it more of a snapshot, which is a good way of sharing initial ideas with people. Although the amount of times that people would mistake these for actual websites, that was a big issue with clients. So style tiles were very much more leaning towards the production end of things. And they did tend to have a little bit of a mixture of the functional and the perceptual in them. They were produced by specialists, but could mostly be used by generalists as long as they didn't think they were websites. And they could start thinking more about cross-platform design. And now we come to my real bugbear, really kind of the reason I started writing this talk. The life of the deliverable, the way I was talking about how you can produce these speculative artifacts that just get chucked away. At one end, we have disposable deliverables, which have their own purpose. As means of communication, they're incredibly important. We can't be too precious about the work we produce. They're throwaway for that very good reason. And some just go out of date quickly, and that is the nature of the process. But at the other end, we have living documents. And really, these have gained popularity over the last decade because we can keep iterating on what we're building, because we are designing for tech, which we can iterate upon. We can do new releases. We can update it. We're not designing posters. And so here we can see that wireframes and flow diagrams are rightly kind of throwaway deliverables. But when we get towards documents like style guides, they're much more living documents, which is why in the early 2010s, along with style tiles, we got design systems and pattern libraries. And this is from Brad Frost's Atomic Design, where design elements could be componentized and built upon, and you can create a whole library of patterns that can be used to assemble a design. And design systems themselves are an attempt to have these more living deliverables. They're useful for a longer amount of time. So they're really high on that life scale. In 2013 was the Snowden revelations. I don't know about any of you. This had a huge impact on me. This was the revelation that the National Security Agency in the US was conducting massive surveillance on the web. And this really started my pivot into privacy, because I was like, okay, it's one thing for a government to be spying on everyone in the world, but it's the fact that there's the big tech platforms that are actually handing all this data over. They don't need to have a particularly complex surveillance network when you can just go to Facebook and Twitter and say, I want the keys to that, thank you very much. Privacy is the right to choose what you want to share and what you want to keep to yourself. And this is almost an impossible thing to maintain when just about every service and product on the web is collecting vast amounts of data about us and using that data to make assumptions about us and using that data to discriminate against us. So this is 2 examples from Facebook quite a long time ago. I mean, if anyone remembers the talk that I gave at this very conference 7 years ago, this is the kind of thing I was talking about, where you get what might seem like a fairly harmless recommended advert for dresses because you're a woman in her 20s or 30s or whatever. It's kind of maintaining a stereotype. It's kind of a societal pressure. On the other hand, getting constant adverts for pregnancy tests, which I very much get all the time on every single platform because I am a woman and they consider that that is what my means is. That is the point of me, is to reproduce, and so I must be shown adverts for pregnancy tests at all times. That could actually be quite harmful to people. Privacy is just another aspect that falls on the edge of design. It's something that we very rarely even consider. And while we absolutely cannot change that lucrative business model of a lot of our employers, let's be fair, we can do better at trying to design for respecting privacy by default. We can question the value of potentially harmful features. We can design features to work without personal data. We can try to do better in society with our design. So unsurprisingly, on the privacy front, from 2015 onwards, we have seen the rise of end-to-end cloud-based design tools. It's a great way of collecting data. But it's where these tools that are aimed at designers are in themselves massive corporations. Like, our tools are now a huge industry in itself. We have Adobe, we have Sketch, we have Figma, Webflow even. They're all focused on our experiences, not the focus of the end user. So what happens when so much of the focus is on how we feel and not necessarily about those who are on the receiving end of our products? So over the last decade, particularly in the last 5 years, we've seen inclusivity become more of a priority in design. Inclusivity does encompass accessibility, but it also involves designing for people who are more traditionally marginalized by technology or with technology. Those people who are often left on the edges. Whether they're left on the edges because they don't have access to technology or because the design of the technology actually discriminates against them, against their race, against their sexuality, against their gender, there's many ways in which you can be discriminated against by technology. And sometimes inclusivity is addressed by tech companies, but usually it's pretty superficial, like, oh, hey, it's Pride Month, let's make our logo rainbow flag colors. But we can design much better for inclusivity by designing specifically for the needs of those marginalized groups. Another facet of inclusivity is also safety. It's the flip side of creating platforms that are safe for people to use to prevent them from being discriminated against, to prevent harm from being done with what we're building. And it's all very well to point out that any tool could be used to create harm. Yeah, sure, that's the case. You could create harm with a pencil and a pen. But it's another thing to actually try to design in order to prevent these things from happening, to make it difficult for people to cause harm with what we're building. Although we have very little choice when the business goals of what we're building in themselves create harm. So as we're at Front Conference, there is, of course, a lot of developers here, so I could not miss talking about designing in code. It is a vital deliverable that we use all the time. It's what devs are doing when they think they're not designing, but they've started coding before they have anything to use. And it's how many of us work on our own sites and on smaller projects. It's a content-out approach. And so that's very much focusing on the production end of the spectrum. It's a mixture of functional and perceptual, because I don't know about you, I've spent many hours fiddling with the CSS, deciding on the look and feel of a site, and it's really a living document. The flip side of designing in code is the trend for low-code and no-code tools. And these are tools that can generate code from diagrams, and they can, from interface design, they can generate all the code from that. So designers can work without developers. Or even some developers can use these to produce sites faster. And Webflow is a good example of this. Which brings me to the final deliverable I want to talk about today, which is state charts, which most of you probably not familiar with. And they're kind of like flow diagrams, but for the states in your app. So where the boxes, which are the states, and the arrows, which are the transitions, they have quite specific rules about how they work. For example, the state in the top left with the little circle with the little arrow pointing to it, that's saying that's the initial state. And the benefit of having these slightly stricter rules about how you use boxes and arrows is that this can also be rendered in code. It can also, this is not just planning your application logic, it is your application logic. And I think that this is quite a cool example on the scale because it's very much used in production. It's very functional. It's not about the appearance necessarily of what you're building, but it is totally a living document that is also visual. Because it's boxes and arrows, it can be produced by, you need some understanding, but it can be used by general people. And the audience, I mean, everyone understands boxes and arrows, and is very much cross-platform because your logic can be used cross-platform. So granted, I am pretty cynical about the tech industry in general. If anyone has spoken to me here for more than 5 minutes, they would guess that very quickly. I think working in tech for 13 years will generally do that to you. But I think we're at a tricky point, both globally and in the industry. Like the rise of interest rates, inflation, war, all of these have started to impact investment. And we have to think about, like, what do we want our future to be? Do we want to be these massive teams working in silos, componentizing design to the point where we don't truly know what we're working on or what we're contributing towards? We don't know anything about the people using what we've built. We don't understand the impact of it. We speed through the design process, forgetting about all of those elements that get lost on the edges because we think somebody else, some other team on the project is going to handle it. So let's talk about deliverables. How do we make sure that our deliverables have an impact on the final outcome of a project? Like this is my vibe. Your vibe may vary. Living over disposable, because that's how we know that what we're building is actually going to get used. Created by an expert, but in a way that can be consumed by a general audience. Because none of us want to think that our jobs can be replaced by some kind of auto-generated situation. And we know, I mean, especially if you work in accessibility, you know that code is not going to be accessible. And we got to remember that much of the value in our deliverables is not the documents themselves, but the communication that goes along with those documents. It's how we describe what the purpose of the document is. It's how we share it. Very rarely can a document standalone and still be useful. Like imagine watching these slides without having the talk to accompany it. Absolutely useless. Things like annotation, documentation, just explanation. These are all really useful and vital parts of the design process. And pretty much all design is impactful. By the very nature of working in technology, people use what we build more than they use public services, more than they use roads. What we build is part of the vital infrastructure of people's social lives, people's working lives. It's very easy to have a negative impact with what you're building. And so in order to stop things from falling off the edges, we need to kind of treat this as a filter. So we need to have a filter in our process where we consider the accessibility, where we consider the inclusivity, where we consider the safety, where we consider the privacy. Put everything through those filters before we get to the design step, or during the design step, or regularly throughout the process as much as we can, so nothing gets lost in the edges. We need to question the success criteria we have for our work. Are we facilitating growth at other people's expense? Why are we adding the features that we're adding? Who benefits from them? Who loses? And we can make sites more usable and less hostile to the people that are using them, and we can make sites inclusive and more accessible. But if we're doing all of that with a bad, invasive, and exploitative business model, all we're doing is leading more people into exploitation. Many of our industry standards are bad practices. We just do it because everybody else is doing them. And I don't necessarily come to you with solutions because you know your work far better than I do. I don't pretend to know your work better than you do. But I just know that you're people in the position to actually find solutions. I speak at events like this because I know you're the people that can help make change. I've been speaking at events on these kinds of topics for the last 8 years. And while I've seen awareness increase, action, not so much. And after my talks, a lot of people will come to me and go, well, how can I make change where I am? I don't feel like I'm able to do that. And so I've come up with the following approach that I'm going to rock through really quickly, keep to Swiss time. These are the types of characters I've recognized in the people around me who are making change. And we have to work out how to use the ones to our advantage. Find out which person we are. So the first is be different. Be different from the mainstream. We've got to be the person who creates alternatives, seeks alternatives. Be better at your work. Like actually understand how things work and what good alternatives might be. Work out how to create fun and useful experiences for our users in a way that doesn't exploit them. Be the advisor. Be that person who does the research on inclusive and ethical technology. Understand the space that we're in. Understand what is actually possible. And make recommendations to other people. Make it harder for them to make excuses. Be the advocate. Speak up. Like marginalized people shouldn't always have to be the ones who are speaking up for themselves. If you're not marginalized, use your voice. Advocate for the underrepresented, the people whose voices can't be heard, and make space for them so that their voices can be heard over yours. Be the questioner. Question those norms, those bad practices that we use industry-wide. Interrogate every decision that is made on your team. Don't be afraid to question the intent or the impact behind your own decisions and the decisions of other people. Your questions don't need to be hostile. You can go a long way with a very innocent question. And try asking a business like, how do you make money? Be the guardian. When the advocacy isn't getting you far enough, stand in the way of bad decisions. Use your expertise to prevent unethical design from happening on your watch. Be difficult. I'm really good at this one. Be the person who is known for always bringing up that issue. Embrace the awkwardness. The awkwardness means you have power. Call out questionable behavior. Like, don't let anybody tell you that standing up for yourself or for others is unprofessional. It's not. Don't let people tell you to be quiet or that you'll get it done better if you smile more. Be the supporter. If you are not comfortable speaking up for yourself, and I fully understand a lot of people aren't, be there for those who do. Raise awareness in your network and in your community, at your workplace. Support those people who are doing the hard work. Be vocal. Be generous in your support. Because the folks who are working against the mainstream don't have an easy time of it. A little love does go a long way. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was great, really inspiring. Please, if you have any questions, put them into Veto. I'm not going to be taking questions from the audience. I'm only going to be taking questions from here. So let's see. Nick has a question. Okay, so first question comes from Thomas. Laura, do you think the perception of the importance of accessibility, thank you, changed over the years? Are we on the right path?
I think very few people deny the importance of accessibility. It's whether that awareness actually translates into action. I think that over the years I've met a lot of people who have just got into accessibility. It's funny how everyone's always just starting getting into accessibility. But we've got to make sure that that actually permeates through into everything that we're working on. It's hard to judge whether we're better or worse at these things. I think, let's say we're getting better. Yeah, I'll choose to be optimistic on that front.
I definitely think there's more awareness for it, just generally across the board.
Yeah, I think we're generally, as a community, as a culture, we're becoming more aware of the people around us in general. That's what globalization and what social networks are allowing us to do. And I think that is helping us increase our awareness as well.
Yeah. And plus with the whole, pandemic and everything, I feel like accessibility has become a much more much bigger part of how we think about just our society in general.
Yeah, having a live stream for your event, that makes it more accessible to people who can't attend in person is a great example of that, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, thanks. So, Nigel, you're still here, has another question. Laura, I agree that targeted ads can be harmful, but can you expand a bit more on how?
Okay, so there's two ways in which targeted ads are harmful. One is that targeted ads are the symptom, and what they are the symptom of is the fact that pretty much every single website has multiple tracking scripts that are just collecting information about you. Whether that information is true or not, whether it's like correct or not is a different matter, but it is often taking information about you that it can find, comparing it against existing information that is about you in various databases, whether it be insurance or government or all kinds of databases, putting you in boxes in order to make you easy to target with ads. And so that is a sign of a bigger invasion of privacy, which also that information can be used, even if it is incorrect, to discriminate against you. So next time you go to buy insurance, they probably have compared that against all of the data that is about you in the system that's been collected about you on the web. I mean, if your government is hostile to you, they'll be able to use that information. So there's many ways. I can direct you to more resources on that if anyone, it's a long story. But it's also, the other side of it is that targeted ads are often, because we are put in boxes, they very much are used to reinforce stereotypes. And I don't know if anyone else uses social networks a lot, and you find yourself affected by the posts that you see. And that is an algorithm that's making that decision. And the same goes for those targeted ads. They're deciding the type of person you should be and broadcasting ads to you. Even if you don't buy those things, you're affected by seeing those ads.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, I mute all the ads on Twitter now, but it's just not helping.
Yeah, but then they're still choosing what tweets you see and what order you see them, and that's influencing you as well.
And they always change the setting of the tweets that you see. So I always switch back to latest because I want to see the people that I follow. But they always sneakily change back to this oh, we curated this thing for you.
We curated this 100 different tweets saying 10 things you need to know about this.
Oh, now they have this thing where if you read a tweet thread to the end or something, there's just more tweets. There's just random other tweets at the end, and you don't even realize that you're not reading the same thread anymore.
They found a way to put infinite scroll inside infinite scroll.
All right, so does anyone have more questions? Because we still have a bit of time. Doesn't look like it. All right. So up next, thanks Laura.
I am very friendly. You can come find me in person if you have any questions.
Thanks. Everyone give it up for Laura, please.